positive and which statements do you feel are normative? So just as you jump into the Nearpod room, there's the very first thing to do. Which statements are positive? Which statements are normative? Match the pairs. Oh, here we go. Notice you've got a head start on everybody. All right, there we go. Oh, good results. Keep going. Couple more to have a go. Fantastic, look at that. All right, it's not as easy as it first appears. All right, another couple of seconds. All right, last call for last call. Have a go. See if you can get them all. Last call. All good work. All right, and this is what we should have had. All right, positive and normative statements. Okay, we've got statements that have shoulds. We've got statements that are really quite descriptive with regards to what they're talking about. And there's a subjective comment. Economics is a study of choices. Households save too little. If household savings increase, there will be a fall in. So that's a very definite statement. All right, well done, team. So as said, we're thinking about how we as economists think. How do we see the world? We use this thing called the scientific method, but we don't use it quite the same way, perhaps, as everybody else does, because we're a social science. So we're trying to apply a scientific method to the way people think and the way people behave. So it isn't always as precise, perhaps, as maybe other sciences might be, right? So we're a social science. We are looking at behavior. We are looking at decisions that people make, whether they're consumers, whether they're producers, whether they're the government. They're all dealing with this idea of scarcity of choice. Right? They're all dealing with this idea that they have to make decisions to deal with limited resources. So we need to make sure we can come up with examples for both positive and normative statements. We need to be clear as to what the difference between the two are. Which ones are subjective, which ones are objective, which ones are value-based, which ones are going to be more useful from a policy point of view, and which ones are going to be more useful in the sense of thinking about where the public wants us to possibly look in terms of government decisions. If economics is a science, then theoretically it should follow a traditional sciencey thinking, right? So our methodology, how do we approach, what methods do we use to figure out all this idea about science, the science of behavior? What methods do we use? So the first aspect of the methods that we use is about logic. So thinking about what the systems are, right, behind the decisions that get made. So we need to have a logical or a systematic approach to why an event has occurred, and then predicting why that might then occur in the future, or why something else might occur in the future. So it's economics' attempt at logic. We're going to use reasoning. So if you're not familiar with it, here's what we have. We're going to have a series of statements where each one would be true if the one preceding it or before it was also true. So when it is cloudy, it rains. It is raining currently, therefore there has to be clouds in the sky. So that's following a logical chain of reason, right? So causal chains. And your task is going to be to create your own three-statement logical reasoning statement. Sorry about the use of the word statement in there. So three statements that follow that same logical reasoning structure, all right? So thinking about causal chains. This leads to this, which means that. All right, have a go. See what you can come up with. All right. I get very tired. My room is very cozy. I went to sleep. Okay. Water is boiling. The pot is hot. The stove is on. Okay. My room is cold. I cover myself with a blanket. I took a nap. All right. When I'm hungry, I want food. I'm hungry, therefore I want food. Send stuff to Nexus, please. Well done, Adam. I pick up the basketball, I shoot it, and then I miss. Okay. I do maths homework, I flip the page, I give up and watch Netflix. Oh dear. A dog is an animal. I have a pet dog. I have an animal. All right. That's very good, Joshua. All right. So the idea of these statements is that they are true based on the previous statements that get made, and they come in threes. All right. So you have some form of conclusion that is predicated, caused by the previous statement, which is caused by the statement before that. So it is a logical chain of reasoning. All humans are mammals. I am a human, therefore I am a mammal. That sort of idea, right, is what we're going for. The idea is that in economics we use this principle of logic to try to gain a causal chain of reasoning. Right? So whether it's about the prices of goods and services, whether it's about consumer behavior, this is going to happen, which is going to cause them to do this, which is going to cause them to do that. That sort of approach is what we use then in economics, the idea that we have a logical chain of reasoning. Right. Now, this method we have, right, to gain knowledge or information about the world, okay, the first step of it we call a hypothesis. Right? It is about cause and effect. So if something happens, then something else happens. Cause and effect. right? So you can probably think of many examples of causes and effect, and then we're going to come up with variables that we can test. So it's a hypothesis and then a test. So if this happens, then that should happen. What are the variables involved? How might we test for this particular hypothesis? So again, just like real scientists, we in economics land come up with these hypotheses, right? Hypotheses. We come up with this, right? And then we use those if-then statements to try and sort out the idea of cause and effect. That logical chain of reasoning again. So the first bit, a hypothesis, but what if something we hadn't thought of interferes with that experiment? So we introduced this concept all the way back. We talked about ceteris paribus, and our phrase ceteris paribus was about our hypothesis needing to work. So we have to make assumptions, right? And the assumptions that we make in order to keep our hypothesis working is a statement made where we say it is true because it enables us to build our hypothesis. So the assumption we make is all other things being equal, right? So we keep all of those things outside of our equation. So we're not looking at those, we're not thinking about those, we're just focusing in on the things that are needed for our hypothesis. If we include every other variable, then our hypothesis won't work. Okay. Now you might make that argument that this is then different from the normal sciences. Okay, so in normal sciences, maybe they don't do this. Okay, they don't have assumptions. Maybe they have less assumptions. Maybe because our hypotheses are about behavior, maybe the assumptions we make it so that it is not quite as true as perhaps a normal science. A normal science? All right. All other things being equal. Other things, those are the things that are variables outside of the hypothesis. So we're going to restrict those. So one of the classic examples that we talk about in economics with regards to this idea of keeping everything else out is the idea of demand. When we were discussing demand, or when we discuss demand, we are going to limit our conversation to only two variables: price, the price of the good, and the quantity demanded. So when we talk about your demand or Adam's demand for pizza to be sent to the boarding house, we only ask the questions about price and what quantity is demanded. We're not going to consider any other variables, none. Right? Those are the only two variables that we will consider. That way we can have some form of hypothesis that might actually work. Here's a wee fill in the gaps exercise. Chuck the words into the place where the sentences best make sense. There you go. Give you about 30 odd seconds to have a go at that. All right, oh, look at these scores coming in. Excellent. Waiting on a couple more. Couple more for a couple more. It is a little bit TOKE, but it's subject-based TOKE. So it is that sort of time when you start thinking about, you know, the subjects that you take and how they use the knowledge that they have, or how they come up with the knowledge that they have. Right. Well done, team. So things we were thinking here, ceteris paribus is a Latin phrase meaning all other things are equal. It enables us to lock our experiments to a limited number of variables to ensure that we can reliably test the hypothesis presented. Well done. We never said it was the real world. That's one thing that's really significant. When we are discussing hypotheses, right, it is about the hypothetical world. It is about the models that we have created. These are assumptions that we're making. These are approximations of the real world, but they aren't actually the real world, right? It would be far too complicated for us to create a model that exactly represented everything there is in the real world. Just as it would be almost impossible for us to create, I mean, I guess these days you're talking about computer programs, you can probably get close to real human behavior, right? But, you know, still it would be very difficult to do, and very difficult to do in an aggregate sort of scale. So, next thing we need to think about is this concept in science of empirical evidence, right? The evidence from the empire. When we are comparing our predictions with the real world, right? So we've got our hypothesis, we've done some testing, right? The evidence that we find is then our empirical evidence, right? That's what we have. And we use that evidence to hopefully give us what we understand, like proving or disproving the hypothesis, and therefore telling us what is truth in an economic sense, what the law is in an economic sense. Right? So this is where economics and other sciences might differ, because in economics, our experimentation is going to be quite limited. Right? It is much more difficult, as said, to create these real-life experiments, right, for economics, whereas in science, you're probably able to get the different chemicals or physical structures to actually have an experiment. In economics, we use what's called, quite often we use maths, the maths of economics. So econometrics is a fancy word. Feel free to look it up, should you wish. It is all about math magic. And at university level, that's when you are likely to stumble across econometrics, and more likely to do that sort of perhaps at a postgraduate level. You might do some econometrics at an undergraduate level. I did some at undergrad, and then did quite a lot at the postgrad level. Okay, good. So is it possible to get the truth of a statement about the real world if we're using empirical testing? And then therefore, very TOK, can we ever be truly certain of the truth of the statement about the real world, right? So from economics, using the principles that we've said, that causal chain analysis, right, is it possible to come up with the truth? What do you think? 30 odd seconds, have a go at this. Okay. Yes, you can get the truth of a statement about the real world, especially when one uses empirical testing, most notably when it is not biased. Okay. You'll be truly certain, there are probably thousands of outliers here. That's a good point. Model the real world, never be 100%. Oh, good thinking. The factors are true, there isn't any flaws. The data is collected, but it can only support the hypothesis. Ooh, good thinking. Gosh, you guys are good at this already. All right. Okay, give you about another 20 seconds. Have a go. What do you think? Is it possible? To achieve. Oh, good. None. Yeah. Okay. Good answers coming in. All right. Last call for last call. There's only a couple more to have a go. So eventually, as you've figured out, eventually in the TOK world, you're going to be asked to use your subjects as evidence with regards to knowledge, right? So the knowledge of the subject and how is it true and can it ever be true? You know, these sorts of questions, but about specific subjects, and then comparing one subject with another, like say the natural sciences with the social sciences. That's sort of an idea, that's sort of an approach. And then point even further in the future, you're going to get like little essay questions, and those questions are, you know, it's not too dissimilar from that one, but it'll then say using evidence from, say, two subjects that you take, two areas of knowledge sort of idea. All right? Okay. Well done, team. Okay. Economics has a whole bunch of theories. Now, these are general explanations about relationships. They're theories. Sometimes those theories are based on a hypothesis, but not always. The hypothesis may not have even been tested or proved. Right? But a theory is a very good way to explore a complex system and an attempt to organize it to explain why something might have happened. Because of the degree of complexity, the best we might be able to do in economics is to create theories. Those theories are sometimes based on hypothesis. Other times it's just, here's a theory, right? There's some sort of relationship here, and we aren't necessarily even able to test for that. We just have to take the theory and see if it works. Right? So we have an example of that. Is this idea of utility theory. Now, we haven't done the work with regards to utility theory yet. Okay, we will do, but it is an attempt to explain why you buy a particular good or service. All right? It is an attempt to explain why you might buy more of a particular good. It is an attempt to explain why you might buy that good over another good, and it is an attempt to link the idea of price, the price of goods and services to your decision making. Right? So that theory we will look at, right? But it is definitely a theory, and there are lots of assumptions tied into that as a theory. We also in economics have things that we are going to call laws, and they should be based on mathematical proofs. They should have been tested. They should have been proved through the maths many, many times, and therefore we would say that they are true. However, they're going to be simpler than the theories that we have, and they're not necessarily explaining events, okay? More that they are giving you a tool, a law, to be able to predict what will happen, right? So the law of demand that we use in economics has predictive power, but it doesn't actually explain why. So that idea of utility, the theory about utility, is an attempt to explain why, but the law of demand is what we use to predict what will happen. All right. They are going to relate to each other. I just put this thing in about laws, okay? Because it's different from obviously the legal framework sort of laws. And I found it quite funny that in France, okay, that it's actually illegal to fly or to land your flying saucers in that particular area of France because of the vineyards. They don't want you to land your flying saucer in the vineyard. I find that funny. Now, we also use models. We do use models in a somewhat different way to Donald Trump. Okay, there's a wee joke or two there, but we'll pass that, right? In economics, our models are expressions of relationships. They are diagrams. They are mathematical equations. That's what we are using when we say the word models, right? They're an approximation of reality. They're closely related to the theories and the laws that we've talked about, but they're built on the foundation of the theories and the laws, right? And so we are often going to, this is one of the criticisms of economists, is that we will use words like model and theory and we'll use them kind of interchangeably. And that's probably not the best. But because they have a basis, right, perhaps in maths, and therefore the proofs of maths, then we're very happy to use models to approximate reality. All right. Some models are purely descriptive. So the PPC that you looked at before, right, is very descriptive. Right? The theory, therefore, isn't used, nor is there an explanation involved. It is just the model. Right? So you are going to get a variety of models, and you're going to need to know a large number of diagrams. But don't worry too much about that. Okay? Now, the next principle, right, what we have in our logic causal chain, right, is this idea of refutation, right? The ability to say something is wrong, to be able to contradict something, to be able to disprove it. So we've got our hypothesis. We should be able to test it. We should be able to prove or disprove it. So therefore, that's scientific. That's what science tells us. In economics, our hypotheses, our theories should also be able to be tested. They should also be able to be proved or disproved. But if they can't, then we would say that they are not scientific. Right? So this idea of falsifiability, oh, that's a fancy word, or refutation is needed in economics because we're a social science, because we're dealing with behavior. We have to be able to say, is this true or is this false? We have to have that idea of a causal chain. That's really quite important, because if we haven't got that, then we're not scientific at all, right? Because the behaviors that we're dealing with are so complicated, and it is going to be non-scientific if we are unable to test them, unable to prove if they are right or not. All right. Have you ever heard of a gentleman called Richard Thaler? I pronounce it Thaler. I'm thinking possibly could be pronounced in different ways. I don't think any of you chose Richard Thaler for your presentations. Oops, got a B? No. We've got some C's, not sure. Or B's. Okay. He is becoming increasingly famous. And yes, he is an IB, although it's his theories that end up in IB, not necessarily him in and of himself. All right. So what did he think about? Well, let's have a look. This. Hopefully this will work. Okay, let's see if this works.
Economics correspondent Paul Salmon spends a lot of time trying to explain and assess why markets, individuals, consumers, and businesses behave the way they do. But there's a growing school of thought that says the traditional answers to those questions may not be the correct ones. Paul caught up with one of the leading thinkers changing the way we look at economic behavior as part of his series, Making Sense, which airs every Thursday on the NewsHour.
Millennium Park Richard Thaler, an academic revolutionary who thinks his field, economics, has a weirdly distorted view of human behavior, that we're all rational maximizers, mathematical machines who use our unusually big brains to wisely calculate every decision as we strive to get to the top, thus creating perfect markets to make us better off. Yet, says Thaler,
after the 87 crash, when the market fell 20% in a day, and the internet bubble, when the NASDAQ went from 5,000 to 1,400, and then the real estate bubble, which led to a financial crisis from which we're still trying to extricate ourselves, the idea that markets work perfectly is no longer tenable.
Thaler is running his revolution from inside the belly of the beast, the University of Chicago, which boasts 28 Nobel laureates practiced in traditional economics. Collectively, they've created what's known as the Chicago School, predicated on the perfect efficiency of markets in which prices rationally reflect all available information.
What's the basic underlying assumption made in the Chicago School of Economics? What were they saying was the main problem with economic thinking? Have a go. Yes, well done, Senna. Yes, you're right, Mal. Yeah. Absolutely, well done. Yeah, okay. Good work, Eason. Right, another 30 odd seconds. Last call for last call. What's the main problem with the science of economics? Good work. Yes, absolutely. The main problem with economics, as it has traditionally been, is that idea that all people are rational, okay? And that markets, therefore, are perfect because people behave exactly rationally as expected. So you've got the laws, they behave as the law says, okay? Because that's the rational thing, right? But as you and I know, that's not quite always how people behave.
But at a lunch with STAR students, Thaler offered his latest favorite example of markets behaving badly. A closed-end stock fund called the Hertzfeld Caribbean Basin Fund,
ticker symbol CUBA. Now, needless to say, it cannot and does not invest in Cuba. That's against the law. And there wouldn't be anything to buy anyway. There are no traded securities in Cuba.
Now, typically, the shares of closed-end funds, which simply own a basket of stocks, shouldn't be worth more than the stocks themselves. Otherwise, you could save money by just buying the stocks yourself.
Nevertheless, the day that President Obama made an announcement that relationships with Cuba would be eased, this fund shot to a 70% premium. And
why do you think the price of the fund, the Cuba fund, increased after President Obama's announcement? What's the connection between the fund and the announcement? What do you think? A little bit harder to answer, possibly. Yes, that's right. Well done, Eason. Yeah, that is right. But why? What was it? What was the connection between the two? Yes, that's right, Iqbal. Well done. They thought it was the same because it was the name. That's right. It was a misconception that the fund was about Cuba. So therefore, it pushed the price up because people thought that relations between America and Cuba were going to be improving. So therefore, the value of this fund, which is called the Cuba Fund, would also increase. So it's that idea about how rational is that? Okay, is that what we expected to happen? Well, no, it's not. Didn't expect that to happen. Couldn't have predicted.
And is now selling at about a 40%.
Now, to be fair, the fund does invest in firms likely to benefit from economic development throughout the Caribbean, including Cuba. But that doesn't explain why shares of the fund are now worth a whopping $140 for every $100 worth of actual stocks in the fund.
Cuba. Good. Price goes up. Would you say that's consistent with a rational, efficient market?
Thaler started noticing such market anomalies early in his career as an economist.
The market would go up in January. It would go up on Fridays, down on Mondays.
Right. You may not have caught this, but what did he notice happen about the stock market? So he was a bit quiet and the question came a bit quick. But he noted that the stock market went up in January. It went up on a Friday and it went down on a Monday. So that's not what you would say is a typically rational, expected thing for the market to do. Yes, there were abnormalities and anomalies, absolutely.
It would go up on the day before holidays. None of this made any sense.
so he began challenging economic orthodoxies. Today, his version of economics, behavioral economics, has finally taken hold. A story that he tells in his new book, Misbehaving. It's a hit even here in Orthodox Chicago, where the book's very price is an example of economic irrationality.
My book is 30% off, and people love deals. They can be driven to purchase things that they don't really want if the deal is good enough.
By contrast, Chicago school economists long argued that if someone chooses to buy Thaler's book, say, or anything else, that's proof enough that they want it at the price being paid. Deal or no deal.
All right. So what do you think is the difference? Sorry, it cuts off quite quick into the questions. What do you think is the difference between how the Chicago school thinks of pricing decisions and how Thaler was thinking about pricing decisions? Here we go, got about 30 seconds more. Yes, well done. That's exactly right. All right. I've got a couple more coming in. Yep. Yes, that's right. Yes, absolutely. So the point being is that the traditional approach to economics is going to lay the demand at the feet of the price, right? Quantity demanded, price. And so if you're prepared to pay for it, then you want the good, right? Whereas Thaler is actually arguing that if you give it a good enough deal, it will encourage people to buy it, whether they desired to have it, whether they wanted to have it or not. So it's all about the deal.
All human behavior, says Thaler, was reduced to similar absurdities, usually accompanied by mathematical equations.
Marry the optimal wife. Get divorced when the utility of being married turned negative.
But it was only when Thaler began doing experiments and publishing them that doctrinaire economists, whom he calls econs, began to admit some of the errors of their ways. Take the concept of sunk costs, time and money already spent. An econ assumes everyone knows when to quit, cut their losses, move on. This group of Cameroonian students at first seemed to get that.
Let's suppose you bought tickets to go to a concert over here at this fancy band show, $40 each. And the group is okay, but then it starts to rain. How long do you think you're going to stick around this concert?
Not much. Not much. But what if the sunk costs suddenly swell?
How many of you would have a different decision about staying or leaving if it was $500 as opposed to $40? Every single one of you.
You have to make my money worth it.
You have to make your money worth it.
Yeah.
And your point here?
Well, economists would say, how much you paid for the ticket? Tough luck. If it's $40 or $500, you should just decide whether the music is worth the annoyance of the rain.
Then there's the way most people value their time. As when Riley Gaunt is shopping for a $40 pair of shoes, learns they're on sale for $30.
But it's another store 10-minute drive away.
Okay,
Would you go?
probably.
Okay.
But what if she's shopping for a $200 dress? Then she learns another store is selling for $190.
You think you'd go?
No.
But you
Right. What was wrong with that? Right. So the idea is in the case of the shoe and the dress example, okay, don't worry about the gender, okay, the price difference between the two items is the same. So therefore, in theory, it shouldn't matter whether it's a shoe or a dress when you go to buy it, right? If you've decided that you'd travel the extra distance to buy the shoes, then you should travel the extra distance to buy the dress. But because the dress was worth more, was more expensive, right, the individual decided not to go and buy the dress, okay, but instead choose, no, I'm not going to drive that extra distance. But the actual gain that they made was exactly the same. They would have made $10, in savings, right? So the point being is that in economics and traditional economic thinking, if you make one decision with regards to the cost, you should make that same decision in the next case study as well, regardless of the price. It's still a $10 saving. So you should jump in the car and drive to the dress shop to get the dress, because it's cheaper. Right? Reality tells us that people won't necessarily make that same decision, that they would expect the discount to be bigger in order for it to be worth their time to travel. So I'm just going to quickly go through that one.
But you see the point, right? If 10 minutes is worth $10 to you, it doesn't matter how you're saving the $10, no?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Now that you've heard this explanation, would you change your answer?
No, probably not.
So, Charlie,
Her boyfriend, Charlie Ellis, had his own distinctly non-econ approach to personal finance.
are you pumped about the finals?
I'm so pumped. I'm ready.
We tape this on the eve of the Stanley Cup Finals, eventually won by the Chicago Blackhawks.
Suppose I told you I had 2 tickets to the first home game, about 10 rows behind the penalty box.
I would be so excited.
Now, let's suppose I gave you those 2 tickets.
How much would he demand to sell those tickets?
Man, maybe $500 if I could get that.
500 each?
A pop, yeah.
And how much would he pay if he had to buy the tickets?
Maybe 200.
Okay, so about half.
Yeah.
Now, an econ would say the price to buy or sell should be about the same. But not a human, and not our cameraman, a diehard Blackhawks fan himself who'd heard the entire previous exchange and then gave exactly the same answers.
I would not pay as much as I'm going to sell it for.
And this is after he's heard you do this already.
Yeah, teaching the principles doesn't make people do it.
After nearly 4 decades of trying to prove just how crazy economics can be, Richard Thaler is now running the asylum as president of the American Economic Association. His behavioral economic theories have been put into practice by governments around the world, including ours, in so-called nudge units, based on his previous bestseller. Not bad for a guy who thought he'd never get tenure for such unconventional work. And how does he now feel about being called the inventor of behavioral economics?
One guy can't create a field, but you can get people thinking.
And so he has. This is Paul Salmon reporting for the PBS NewsHour from ever more sensible and unorthodox Chicago, Illinois.
All right. Okay, team, stop the sharing. Jump back. Now, the point there is that behavioral economics is the new field, the new way of thinking, that the traditional or classical ideas in economics we are going to discover they are limited. Okay? Whether that means the behavioral approach, whether that means behavioral economics is more scientific, or if behavioral economics just explains the realities of decision making better than classical economics does. That's something that we can discuss. All right, Tim, you've done a huge amount of work today. Thank you very much. I've posted links to the material that we're going to be covering. It's all up there for you. You've also got links to the Unit 1 website that you can look in your way through. Otherwise, team, hey Cornetta, have a fantastic day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
See you tomorrow.